everyone, and welcome to Patriot Underground. Today is July 1st, 2021. Thank you so much for joining me to discover the truth beneath the surface. Cruising around here on a beautiful day. Didn't know I was actually going to get a few minutes to actually do one last podcast before I head out of town and celebrate our nation's birthday. July 4th has always been my favorite holiday. I suppose it's probably not hard for you folks to imagine that. But there's nothing that makes me more proud than to be able to know that I'm a patriot 365 days a year and not just on July 4th. And I know that all of you out there, all of you that are Americans, of course, bleed red, white, and blue, and you actually know exactly what I'm talking about. How much of an honor it is to be reminded that we were born free. And what a profound statement to know that we'll die the same way, one way or another. I've often pointed that out to folks, people who doubt the commitment that I have and that you have to freedom. There's really no other way to live your life. And we're reminded on the 4th of July how special and how blessed we are to have been born in a free country. And yet at the same time, we're also reminded how much our freedom is under attack. So every July 4th really, in the past few years, for me, has gotten more and more significant. And yes, it's always a celebration, but it's become more and more of a reminder and more really an emotional holiday for me as I've seen so many people willingly cast away their birthright, cast away their freedoms for security. And this is something, of course, Gene Decode talked about this, but it's something that's been said many, many times throughout history, and I think most famously by Benjamin Franklin, that those who sacrifice their liberties for security ultimately end up with neither. Of course, that's a paraphrase. But ultimately, freedom is a choice. Being a free man, a free woman, is a choice. And unfortunately, so many amongst us, as we know, have a slave mentality. Also something that Gene talked about and something that I've mentioned quite a bit. So many of our countrymen and women who think that they're free really have no concept of what it really means to be free. Actually, it brings to mind, a few weeks ago, I was watching a video put out by Sean Stone, and he was talking about this very concept. It was the idea that the Great Awakening is ultimately challenging humanity to step in to their divinely assigned role of being a sovereign being and stepping into their independence and understanding and embracing what freedom really means. It's not the concept of having your government protect you and take care of you and spoon feed everything to you. It's actually being a rugged individualist who thinks for himself or herself. And because so many people out there, to take this a level deeper, so many people in terms of genetics have that mankind DNA, unfortunately, their programming is such that they do not want or understand the concept of freedom. Sure, they like all of the bells and whistles that go along with that word, all the associations. They like to consider themselves free. But when it comes down to actually stepping into that role and taking care of themselves and being accountable, how many people out there really want to do that? I mean, we've talked a lot about, let's just take one example. Healthcare, or freedom of, understanding how to take care of yourself without being dependent upon the system. Or another example, of course, would be self-defense. That's why we all cherish the Second Amendment, because we understand how important that freedom is. But not only that, we accept that role and that responsibility to be prepared to protect ourselves. against any threats. But the brainwashing has gotten so bad, actually I should say it's really gotten so good, depending on your perspective, but it's become so effective that the very freedoms that our forefathers and so many generations after fought, bled, and died for are the same freedoms that people today just want to surrender without a fight. And that's that mind control for you, you see. But I've become really emotional on certain occasions. I can remember in the last year, probably 3 or 4 times when I really just got overwhelmed with sadness in witnessing my fellow Americans. This is, of course, before I started the podcast and connected with all of you great people. But watching my fellow Americans and talking to them and witnessing what was happening in our country, I just became overwhelmed and just sat there and wept for our country. What we had become, what we had given up, how far we had fallen. But as they say, it's always darkest before the dawn. And for me, in my own personal life and my own personal story and journey, the dawn really happened for me when I decided to step into this role and take the plunge and do what was in my heart and try to be of service to my fellows and to do God's work. Of course, at that point, as I've talked about, everything started to change. But before that point, like so many of you, probably all of you, I was just so disheartened and disillusioned and really just felt so broken by what I had witnessed. And so with the July 4th holiday coming up, I think it's important to talk about freedom and what freedom really means and how important it is that we be prepared with the Great Awakening upon us and the big reveal hovering just over our heads. We be prepared to teach our fellows what freedom really looks like and what it really means to be a free man and a free woman and live in a free society and the virtues of it. At one point in time, of course, Americans were a lot different on average than they are today. Of course, that's about as obvious as the nose on your face. But if you go back and you look and you really analyze history and you look at the way people were and the way that they operated and what was important to them, where we are today is almost a complete 180 of where we started as a country. Because your average person just doesn't want that same sense of rugged individuality, like I mentioned a minute ago, that same sense of responsibility. The average person just wants to be taken care of because they've been pampered for so long. They've been conditioned that the object of life is to make things more streamlined and efficient. That everything is really just about getting things done, not really about substance anymore. I mean, when you look at all the different ways that the cabal has broken down what used to be the backbone of this society, it's really sad to see how selfish and narcissistic we have become. Because at one point, Americans really did care, and I've talked about this, but Americans really did care for one another. And it's always pops out to me when I watch a movie. It could be an old movie, it could be a new movie, it could be a TV show, but anything that's a period piece that takes you back in time, even a few decades. And what you see in the scenes always is the same thing. Before cell phones, before the internet, before all of the distractions, which of course the internet is a great thing. The internet, on one hand, it's enabling us to be able to connect with one another. But before all of these distractions, before the obsession with celebrity and the obsession with me, and wanting to be famous and wanting everybody to know your name. And before all of that stuff, our culture was just a very, very different. And at what point it actually shifted? Well, I don't think you can really say. I think it was a gradual shift, a gradual de-evolution, I suppose. And we've really devolved into a bunch of mindless zombies on average. Now, of course, that is changing, as we talked about yesterday, or the last podcast I did. I talked about the most recent poll from Reuters that pointed out that Americans truly are waking up. Just about 3 out of 4 Americans do not trust the mainstream media anymore, and that's fantastic. So this is changing, and we know that it's going to change, and we know that our society will awaken. But of course, we're still in that interim period where we're going through, and we're still witnessing. We kind of have a foot in both different worlds. On the one hand, we still see the sleeping masses, but on the other hand, we start to see that the numbers of those masses are starting to dwindle, and more people are paying attention. And I think it's going to be a great thing when Americans rediscover their birthright, rediscover their roots, where they came from. Because I can tell you one thing, I know that previous generations, especially going back to our founding fathers, are turning over in their graves, witnessing what's happened in our nation over the past so many decades. And I can imagine all of them looking down upon us. And we talk about our frustration a lot with all of the sheep out there not being able to wake people up. Can you imagine the spirits of our ancestors looking down at what we've done with the country that they gave to us, that they inherited, what we inherited from them, from their sacrifice? And it's amazing because your average person has no appreciation of that sacrifice. Sure, they give, they virtue signal, and they talk about on Memorial Day, or on July 4th, or on certain holidays, they'll make a little post out there and they'll virtue signal about it. But when it comes down to brass tacks, when it comes down to policies and politics and what really matters in terms of the direction of our society, these people have no appreciation of the sacrifice that was made, because they have no appreciation of the rights that were secured through those sacrifices. People that are in any way hostile to any of our rights in the Bill of Rights. Let's just talk about the First Amendment and Second Amendment, because they get attacked so viciously. You can't really say on the one hand that you're a patriot and that you believe in freedom and that you believe in the Bill of Rights, and on the other hand say, well, yeah, but at the same time, well, those rights, they're not absolute. They don't really, they're not really that sacred that we can't put restrictions on. You see, I'm a person that believes really in, as far as the First Amendment and Second Amendment go, about as much of a purist as you're going to find. I don't believe in any form of censorship. I really don't. And I certainly don't believe in any infringement upon a law-abiding citizen to be able to wield the means to protect themselves and their families. To me, those things are just so obvious. The Second Amendment is just such an obvious concept. And it really ties back into what I was talking about before with being a sovereign individual. See, people see themselves as part of the collective now. They don't see themselves as a true individual with rights. They only do when it's convenient, of course. But the Second Amendment is just such an obvious concept. Of course, I have the right to defend myself. I have that God-given right. what? Since I haven't really gotten into the Second Amendment, I'm going to start to talk about it some more because there's such a misconception amongst the general population about what its purpose actually is. And as the Great Awakening unfolds, and as I'm sure we're going to see more and more violence across the country, as always, there's going to be this push to try to disarm law-abiding citizens. And I understand that my audience already understands this concept of why the Second Amendment exists. However, with more and more people who are defecting from the mainstream media and from the brainwashing every day, and perhaps stumbling upon my channel amongst others, I think it's important to talk about these things and once again reinforce these concepts and talk about why they're so important. But the Second Amendment was never about hunting, as the left likes to claim. It was never about even so much about personal self-defense. That was never really the true intention. Of course, that was wrapped up in the overall intention of the Second Amendment. But ultimately, what it was really about was the militia, was having the average person, the average citizen, be able to take up arms against a tyrannical government as a last defense, last line of defense. And of course, we talk about this so much nowadays because that's exactly where we're at, isn't it? That's why more and more people are going out and buying guns. And this is another example, I think, of an awakening as well. Because it's not just people out there, and I think Omega talked about this when I had him on. It's not just people out there buying guns that are, already well-established gun owners who are just looking to add to their collection. We're talking about millions and millions and millions of new gun owners over the past several years. I'm not sure exactly what the statistics are. He could probably talk about that with a lot more knowledge, but I certainly know that millions of Americans who never before owned a firearm in the last several years have decided to get armed. And so what's happening, of course, is this is a sign of red pilling as well. People are realizing, and with witnessing all of the riots and all the things that we saw last summer, they're just example after example. People are realizing that the police can't keep them safe. And if things really spiral out of control, the military in some cases won't be able to either. That folks have to take that responsibility seriously for themselves. And people do. People absolutely do. Now, I think that a lot of the violence that we're going to see, a lot of the uprisings or whatever you want to call it, surrounding the Great Reveal are going to be in the city area, in the urban areas. I think the main danger is if the left decides to provoke the American people outside of the cities. If they start to move into certainly the rural areas, but even the suburban areas, and try to cause any kind of terror there, that's where I think you could see potential for a real big problem. Because ultimately, Americans in suburban and rural areas are going to protect their families by any means necessary. And nobody's going to care what the law says if folks are breaking the law and there's no law enforcement there to be able to do anything about it. It becomes our responsibility. And again, like I said, this is part of the Great Awakening, is folks realizing this is why the Second Amendment exists. It's not so you can go out and go plinking with your friends or go down to the range, work on your aim, which I love to do, by the way, or go hunting or anything else. It's there as a defense against tyranny. And of course, the left understands that very well. So that's why they're constantly trying to take away weapons from the American people. We are, as Gene talked about, we're the largest standing army. We have the largest cache of weapons in the world. The American people are armed to the teeth. And that's, of course, a big problem for the deep state, because if we didn't have, I personally believe that if the Second Amendment had fallen in America, it's been obviously very, very weakened, but if it had fallen in America, by now I think we would already see that future that was predicted, which was, of course, it was Orwell who predicted it, the human head being stomped on, or the human face being stomped on by a boot. I think we'd be there already. Because ultimately, what has restrained these evil forces is the counter threat of the American people. I don't even know how many. At one point, I knew the statistics about how many Americans were armed, but it's ridiculous. It's probably just at least 100 million people. Probably way more than that. And forgive me for not knowing this information off the top of my head, but we're talking about a massive number of people. And even if only a small fraction of the amount of American gun owners actually became active in some sort of a conflict, it would be over really, really quickly. The numbers are just so vast. Not to mention that if it ever really came down to, if the American people ever actually had to take up arms, and we got to that point, we'd be fighting, of course, for our lives, for our freedom, for our children. We'd be fighting for everything that matters in life. That's not an enemy that's easy. I shouldn't say an enemy. That's not a force that's easy to defeat. That's the type of force that even the U.S. Army has been unable to defeat. Because when people are fighting with their backs up against the wall, not only that, they're fighting amidst their home, amidst their friends and neighbors. That's a whole different level of resolve. That's a whole different level of commitment. And thank God we haven't gotten to that point. But it also gives me great comfort to know that if it ever does come to that point, God forbid, there's not going to be anything that's going to stop the will of the American people. And so, the Second Amendment, which of course ultimately backs and protects the First Amendment, is absolutely vital. It brings me great joy just to exercise that right, because I know and I understand and feel deeply in my soul and in my heart what it took for me to have the right to walk around or to drive around with my 9mm. I know the sacrifice that it took. And to tell you the truth, I'd be more than willing to make that same sacrifice to secure that right for future generations if it becomes necessary. That's what being a patriot really is. It's ultimately loving your country so much that you're willing to pay that ultimate price. You don't want to, but you would if it came down to it. It's amazing how little so many Americans truly appreciate the freedoms that they have. And this has all been systemically attacked, as we know. There's been a grand scheme behind this to dumb the American population down, really starting from birth. But it's often been talked about that the Constitution in most areas of the country isn't even taught anymore. Civics isn't even taught. In fact, what's taught is how to attack the Constitution, how to attack the American birthright. That's more often than not what students are learning. They're learning how to criticize this country. They're learning how to pick it apart, tear it down. And of course, that's not by accident. But I remember growing up, and I remember when I was in school, and for those of you who are a little bit older, I'm sure you remember as well. I remember being taught to love my country. I remember growing up and singing with pride the national anthem and God Bless America and the Pledge of Allegiance. I grew up in an era where it was commonplace to be proud to be an American, to have pride that you come from the greatest country in the world, and to love and to appreciate the sacrifices that it took to establish this nation. And not only that, what this nation represents to people all over the world. At this point, I have folks listening to my show from, and I'll give a shout out to them now. I don't know them, remember their names, of course, not yet anyway, but I have folks out there who are listening from South Africa, from Austria, from England, from Germany, from France, all over Europe, from Israel, people all over the world already have tuned in. And I mean, that absolutely is mind-blowing to me. But the reason I mention that is because all of those folks, I'm sure, would agree what the United States of America means and what it represents to the rest of the world. And if America falls, if freedom fails here, like General Flynn talks about a lot, that's it. There's really nowhere else to go at that point. If America falls and freedom fails and falls in America, the entire world is going to fall into darkness. And coming back to, of course, our rights, the reason that we haven't, of course, is because Americans increasingly, over the past several years, but as we get closer and closer to this singularity, this quickening has occurred, and people are exercising their primary rights, and it's those primary rights that are holding back the enemy in large part. And it's also what's causing other folks to wake up. I mean, at one point in time, I was asleep too. That's why I have a lot of sympathy for folks out there who are still asleep, who are still victims of this mind control, still victims of this evil matrix. I have a lot of sympathy because I remember what it was like to be trapped inside of it. And I thank God that I was one of the lucky ones who was able to find my way out. But I have a lot of sympathy for our fellows and all those people out there. Yes, they frustrate me to no end. But I also recognize that still in all, God can still touch their heart at any moment. It's a choice. It's free will. Of course, they have to seek it out. The same way all of us did. You have to seek out a relationship with God. But as I've also talked about, my belief is that God works through people. And we are God's people. We are the righteous. We are the believers. And so, of course, God is going to work through us. And God is not willing, I forgot exactly how the phrase goes, but he's not willing or not satisfied to lose even one soul to the enemy. And so we're the ones, this is why I keep emphasizing this, we're the ones who have been divinely ordained to reach out as manifestations of God's will to our fellows to try to educate and to try to bring them under the umbrella of freedom and understand the way the world really works. So July 4th is an enormously significant holiday for a lot of Americans. Of course, and by the way, there's nothing wrong with this, but for a lot of Americans, it's really just about virtue signaling and drinking beer and watching fireworks and having a day off of work. But that's not what it's about for us. People in this audience have a great respect for the United States, for what it represents, not just to our own citizens, but to the entire world. And because we've entered this dark season where freedom is under such assault, It's important to be reminded of these concepts surrounding this, in my opinion, sacred holiday, because I believe that God has always had his hand on America. He's always had America under his protection, under his hedge of protection, ultimately. Even as our society more and more has turned away from God. But that's, of course, starting to change. Just like the historical Great Awakening, when so many folks turned back to God, the same thing is going to happen. It's going to take some more time because our society has become so secularized. And it's become commonplace for folks to scoff at religious people, to scoff at a faith and belief in God, and to mock it. It's going to take a while for that programming, I think, to be reversed. But I do believe that it will, because once people understand all that's been going on in the world, and once people see the miracle of the Great Awakening and they bear witness to it, they're not going to question whether God exists, because everybody is going to understand that the only force in the universe that could have saved us from the absolutely horrific plans of the cabal was God Almighty, through the grace of his Son, Jesus Christ. I get down on my knees every single day and I thank Jesus Christ for his sacrifice, because without that sacrifice, none of us would be reconciled with the Father. I don't want to get into too much Christian talk, because I recognize that there are folks out there who are not Christian, and I certainly welcome all good and decent people out there, regardless of your religious beliefs. I welcome you to this platform and to this digital family. But at the same time, I also am very, very open and honest about my faith and my belief. That there's no greater love than sacrifice. And there was no greater sacrifice than the sacrifice of Christ on the cross to redeem humanity. It's the only reason that you and I and all of us have been able to connect, have been given a chance to stand up against evil. And of course, I don't look at July 4th as a religious holiday, but I also recognize the divine purpose of this nation. And of course, if we're celebrating the birth of this nation, we're also celebrating its divine purpose. So I hope all of you have a wonderful July 4th weekend. I hope this message was well received. I hope you enjoyed this chat. Please let me know in the comments. Please join my Telegram if you haven't already. There's a link in the About page or the description of the video. Please like, subscribe, donate if you can, and I will be back again, hopefully from my location when I'm actually away. Planning on doing at least one coffee chat while I'm up there and recharging my batteries, resting, relaxing, and coming home refreshed and rejuvenated with more energy and hopefully more time to be able to dedicate to this podcast, because this podcast, with every passing day, has become more and more important to me. And my audience members, my affection for you grows daily. So thank you so much for your support. God bless each and every one of you. Patriot out.